Hello and a warm welcome to this session with me, Susanna Streeter, and I'm really delighted to welcome Angel Mendez, transformation leader and executive chairman of LevaData. Angel was also executive vice president and chief operating officer of HERE Technologies, and he's here to share his insight and expertise. Welcome, Angel. Let's set the scene, because economies have emerged from the depths of the pandemic, with many well on the road to recovery, but still there have been many corporate casualties along the way. So are we seeing the survival of the fittest playing out here?
Well, hello, Susanna, and thank you for being with me today. And I appreciate the folks at DPW for having me. I think we are indeed seeing the survival of the fittest, but I do think we need to redefine what we mean by fittest. I think if you think about traditional financial terms, I looked at a statistic the other day where the S&P 500 companies are now hoarding near $2 trillion in cash. Now, you can look at that traditional metric and say, well, of course, it's great business judgment to hoard a lot of cash and be ready for volatility and uncertainty, and to defend your stock and so on when things get tough. But really what we've seen during the pandemic is the survival of the most agile, really the most innovative, the most astute companies, whether there were companies that adjusted to consumer trends that emerged from the pandemic or scaled to supply services and goods to trends that were originally there prior to the pandemic but were enhanced by the pandemic, or whether you saw companies pivot to a whole new line of business or a new set of products or manufacturing PPE or whatever the case may be. What we saw was companies that moved very quickly from triage to innovation and really did so with workforces that in most cases were 100% at home. So that agility, that innovativeness, that astuteness is really what defines fittest in this environment. And I think it will continue to do so. Now, when one looks at what these companies typically have in common, you see a number of factors. Most presently, the culture of the company is one where employees are highly engaged no matter where they are in the world or what their format of engaging with their peers, customers, and suppliers is. And you see companies that have a culture of innovation and a workforce that is quite comfortable with ambiguity. And you also see digital capabilities. Without question, companies that were able to leverage digital capabilities for collaboration, for innovation, for operational effectiveness in general are the ones that were the most agile. So I see that as the new definition of fittest. It's not just your balance sheet, it's not just your financial strength, your market strength, it's how you actually adapt.
Absolutely. And you've spent 35 years right at the heart of some of the world's leading technology companies. You talk about this rapid pace of change, but has it even taken you by surprise over what we've seen over the past 18 months?
Without question. I think the pandemic has clearly tested everything in the world, and that is not an overstatement. That said, we need to put the pandemic in context, right? When supply chain folks that are listening to us today go back to their training on risk management, they often take into account the personality of an event, right? They think of the magnitude of that event. How severe is it? They think about the impact, the breadth of impact of any event, whether it impacts one industry or many, whether it impacts one geography or more than one geography, whether it's impacting a large number of suppliers. And then they look at the duration expectation. How long is this event going to last? And when you look at previous events, whether that would be an earthquake in Japan or that would be Icelandic volcanoes, all of those were measurable in effect, containable, if you will, across all of those three variables. The pandemic doesn't allow us to do that. It's still going on. The Delta variant is still with us. I think there are some who believe we're going to live in some form of pandemic mode for quite some time. So while the pace of change has exploded as a result of the pandemic, it's a black swan event, and it will ultimately come to an end. Now, we can't forget that there's also been a number of other things in the backdrop during COVID, whether it's Brexit or whether it's the tariff wars that have been going on. Heck, the Suez Canal got blocked for a period in time with significant impact to shipping lanes. You name it, we have seen an increase in the pace of change, the number of events. I've seen statistics where McKinsey now estimates that we will see severe disruptive events pretty much every 3 to 4 years. And that doesn't count all the localized events that supply chain professionals contend with. So we are living in a hyper volatile world. I think we have learned that companies that are resilient, companies that are adaptive, as I mentioned earlier, are the ones that are going to be best positioned to deal with the world as we see it and as we'll continue to see it.
Absolutely. And lots of companies have had to deal with this acceleration in business transformation that many believe would take years and just months or even weeks. But now they're moving away from crisis mode. What kinds of problems is this ultra rapid transformation now causing? What issues have been raised, for example, in terms of the security of IT systems?
Well, I think IT security is for sure a major issue, especially now where we have distributed the workplace to our homes. And we see it in infrastructure effects or impacts like the Colonial Pipeline here in the U.S. that affected fuel supply. We see it manifested in attacks to companies like Microsoft. We see it, broadly speaking, in the ransomware trend or ransomware as a service. So without question, we live in a digital dependency mode. We all live in a system of systems, in effect. We use applications. We are working from home. Those applications rely on cloud infrastructures and other applications that allow the cloud to work the way it does. So we're seeing incredible dependencies across the digital spectrum, which makes it, of course, attractive to disrupt by bad actors. So without a doubt, it is a risk that boards are paying a lot of attention to, auditors are paying attention to, governments are paying attention to, and it's a new reality that will exist for a long time. The other thing to bear in mind, besides the cyber issue, is all this volatility, all this disruption represents business opportunity. The cost of cloud services is dropping dramatically, so companies can leverage that ability to gather customers very quickly. And all you have to see or look at is the number of unicorns that are being bred everywhere. 136 of them in the last quarter alone. That's up nearly 500% year on year. So what does that mean? What it means is people are putting the future value of disruption in front of them and as an attractive business opportunity, which means that every established company, large, medium, or small, is going to be disrupted. So it's not just the risks we talked about in terms of the pandemic or the risk of something like cyber, but it's the risk of competition, which can come at you very, very quickly.
Of course, there are other issues looming as well. Supply chain issues and worker shortages are causing an increase in inflation. So how should the procurement industry deal with this in particular?
Yeah, there's no question that we are seeing the impact of inflation. If you look at the numbers, consumer price index in the U.S. is now north of 5%. That's the first time in nearly 15 years that we've seen numbers like that, which means that for a lot of our procurement professionals, this is the first time in their careers that they are having to deal with an inflationary environment. You look at steel up 200%, aluminum at a 10-year high, lumber up 94%. You look at labor supply, 6% in the U.S. of unfilled jobs. That's the first time in over a decade that we've seen those kinds of numbers. So by definition, we will be in this environment for a while. But it's important not to panic. Procurement professionals who have been through this before know that there are things they can do. And the first is to go back to basics. In the short term, procurement folks need to get very, very thoughtful about the drivers of inflation. This is an opportunity, given the environment, for many suppliers to try to get away with price increases that aren't necessarily justified by the underlying elements. This supply chain or this inflation risk is supply driven. And so supply and demand will ultimately come into balance, and some things will smooth out, if you will. So in the short term, it's all about supply assurance and price stability, which means you have to negotiate hard, you have to have very, very crafty cost targets, and really drive your suppliers to prove that that price increase they're demanding is really justified by the underlying cost elements. That's a tactical maneuver. It's going to take some time, but that is what good, solid procurement is all about. And it's getting back to cost analytics.
But do you also think that the acceleration of digital adoption should be a key strategy, given that the use of AI and machine learning can lead to greater efficiencies?
Without question. Past the cost tactics and past the stabilization, you have to build native capabilities that leverage digital technology. I like McKinsey's name for it. They call it, you have to have a volatility toolbox, which involves digital tools. I'm personally involved with 2 companies that use AI very heavily to drive predictive analytics, scenario planning, to help buyers and supply chain professionals anticipate changes so they can have the time to maneuver and prepare for those changes or offset those changes depending on the case. So without question, the power of AI has to come into play, but more importantly, broadly, digital transformation. AI is just an element of digital transformation for sure, but cognitive capabilities are just part of the toolbox. You also have great collaboration techniques that are digitally based. You have to automate as much as you can to allow for capacity to scale. And you then have to create the capacity broadly to deal with the complexity we've been talking about. So no question that in the short term, we're talking about combating inflation with good, strong fundamental sourcing, but in the mid and long term, we have to rely on digital capabilities.
But it's interesting that what we're seeing at the moment and this kind of urgency towards adopting a kind of digital first strategy, particularly with AI, because some organisations have been very reticent, even fearful about adopting AI. So what do you think really needs to change at the heart of a company's culture to make sure they have the best mindset to seize the opportunities it presents?
I love that question because we do run into quite a bit in the topic of AI adoption. And I think it starts with people. Fundamentally, we have to remember that between the amount of data people are required to process, the volatility of change, the productivity requirements that companies are imposing where they expect more from less or certainly from the same labor input, people have to come to the realization that digital tools are going to be part of their arsenal. What we're trying to do with AI is enhance the capability of the human, not replace it. Take the robot out of the human, as a colleague of mine at Kinaxis likes to say, instead of this fear that somehow we are going to be replaced by machines. At the end of the day, procurement, sourcing, supply chain management is a relationship game. You have to have a very strong internal collaboration and cross-functional work at play, particularly at times of high volatility and risk. You have to have great relationship with suppliers, and no machine can easily replace that. That said, we have to build capacity to deal with change, capacity to interpret data. There's no easy way for a human to just build Excel spreadsheet on top of Excel spreadsheet to try to figure out what insights to derive from all the data and all the change in that data. So AI is here to stay, but it has to be thought about in the broader context of digital transformation. We are going to have to rely on digitization. And as I said at the beginning, those that do are the ones that come out ahead in the topic of agility and ingenuity.
Now, at the same time, as companies are trying to deal with, hopefully, the tail end of the pandemic, other macroeconomic challenges are now looming large, not least climate change. So what strategies, Angel, should leaders adopt to cope?
There's no question that the climate risk looms large, and we've seen hurricanes, we've seen the rising impact of floods and fire, and the impact on raw materials, the question of labor migration. All of these things will continue to be a massive factor on supply chain risk. So what do you do about it? Well, for starters, it is now a new filter to look at our supply chain design through. A lot of folks in our audience are quite mature in their supply chain risk management processes. This is a new test, a new stress test that has to be applied. We have to look at our geographic distribution of our supply chain to allow for optionality depending on on where our supply chain nodes are today. Some of them may be very well in high impact areas. We have to look at long-term plans for ingredients and raw materials. One of the examples that I've been reading about recently involves Colgate-Palmolive, for example, who is working very closely with their suppliers to look at the long-term supply of mint, which is something, of course, that permeates many of their products. That's just one example, but it gives you a sense for the planning horizon extension that our supply chain professionals need to have. So first, there are tactics in the near term, but this is a long-term evolution of risk. So mature your risk management processes, look at your long-term horizon, involve your competitors even in consortiums to impact government policy. One has to look at a very strong level, an increased level of collaboration with suppliers to create leverage against something that impacts all of us. So the key is to lean in and not have this be something that happens to you, but something that you can actually be capable of impacting and preparing for.
Would you say that you are ultimately optimistic about the capability for companies to adapt to future crises, given how they've coped with the COVID crisis?
I think I am in general, but you have to break this down a bit to look at where we're better prepared, where we're perhaps less prepared. I tend to look at it through the lens of people, process, and technology. When we look at facing the world ahead with the known volatility, the risks that we've been talking about, getting out of COVID and into a post-COVID world, all of that requires people that are adaptive to change. Environments, cultures, company behaviors that facilitate that adaptability. And for me, it always starts with people. Do you have the right talent? Do you hire and promote the folks that are confident and know, in fact, thrive on change and are always looking forward to that challenge, the ability to face ambiguity? You can screen for that. You can work with teams on that. You can train some of that in, but building people resiliency, particularly at a time where we don't have employees with each other all the time and cultures are fragmented by hybrid environments or working from home environments or whatnot, is vital. You then have to look at processes. You know, I come from the school of very, very strong processes like Lean and Six Sigma and, you know, all sorts of governance processes that allowed for operational excellence. We have to examine how agile those processes are. They're still serving us well. They're good disciplines, but we have to have flexibility in our companies to deal with agility. So there's a balance between rigor and agility that's clearly very important. And then you have to have the technology piece. We've said that multiple times just in this brief conversation. If you're not digitally enabled, you are really in a weak position. You have to have the ability to scale through digitization, to adapt through digitization, to innovate and collaborate through digitization. You just don't have the bandwidth in companies, large or small, to flex in a manual or analog way. So I am optimistic, provided that we do those things, right? Provided that we can get the right talent on board, address our processes with good, solid common sense, and equip ourselves with the right toolkit.
There's a challenge. Hopefully it will be met by all those watching. Angel Mendez, thank you so much. It's been really fascinating to hear your views. Thank you for your valuable insights.
Thank you for having me.